Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual conference titled Canadian Perspectives on NAFTA. My name is Emily Slater, and I am the Deputy Director here at the Bretton Woods Committee. I would like to thank our global audience in attendance, especially all of our Bretton Woods Committee members, as well as our esteemed speakers for joining us today. This program is part of our Regional Spotlight series, which aims to evaluate critical economic, development, and trade issues affecting key countries and regions across the globe. Today, we will examine the implications, challenges, and opportunities for Canada in the creation of a new North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the Attendee Interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. The orange arrow icon pictured here allows you to collapse and expand the control panel. By default, you have joined the presentation's audio using your computer's speaker system or voice over IP. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Please note that if you join via telephone, you may not have the ability to pose questions during the Q&A portion. If you do have a question, please type them into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the virtual conference. We will collect these and call on individuals during the Q&A session at the end of the discussion. Currently, all participants are in listen-only mode as indicated by the muted icon in the middle of your control panel. During the Q&A portion of the presentation, we will unmute individual lines so you can pose questions to the speakers yourself. When you are called upon, you will need to ensure that you click the microphone icon to unmute yourself from your end as well. The microphone icon on your control panel will turn green when your microphone is enabled. Finally, you may view today's virtual conference in full screen mode by clicking the blue square on the control panel. I would now like to briefly introduce our speakers. We have with us today Mr. Benoit Daignault, who is the President and CEO of Export Development Canada. Prior to this position, he served as Senior Vice President of Financing and Investments and of Business Development at EDC. Before joining Export Development Canada, Mr. Daignault spent more than 10 years with General Electric Capital, where he held increasingly senior positions in both Canada and the U.S. We also have with us today Mr. Brett Hughes, Vice President and Deputy Chief Economist at Scotiabank. Mr. Hughes has worked across a range of roles in financial markets, international economic policy, and academia in Canada and abroad. Prior to Scotiabank, Mr. Hughes was the Chief Economist at AlignVest Investment Management, worked as an economist at the IMF, and advised in the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General. And finally, we have with us today Dr. Kent Hughes, who will be moderating our conversation. Dr. Hughes is a Public Policy Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the former Director of the Program on America and the Global Economy there. Prior to joining the center, Dr. Hughes served as the U.S. Department of Commerce Associate Deputy Secretary, President of the Private Sector Council on Competitiveness, and in a number of senior positions with the U.S. Congress. So thank you very much to our speakers for joining us today. And Dr. Hughes, I'll now turn it over to you so you can tell the audience a little bit more about our discussion.
Thank you, Emily, very much, and welcome to the two Canadian speakers. The U.S. and Canada have a very long, very deep economic relationship. The bilateral trade, even if it's just between Windsor and Detroit, sets almost a world record. So thinking again about that economic relationship, taking a serious look at NAFTA and how it might be modernized. After all, NAFTA went into place more than 2 decades ago, and the negotiations for NAFTA, of course, date further back than that. So we'll want to, among other things, look at the implications of a new NAFTA for Canada, for what a new NAFTA might look like in terms of a modernized NAFTA, reflecting the changes in the global economy, and some of the challenges that Canada and the U.S. might face as we work to modernize, upgrade, and change NAFTA for this modern era. Well, let me turn it over now to Mr. Daignault, who will give us a export perspective, I think, from Canada, some of the opportunities that lie ahead for Canada. Please take it from there.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. So I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me well. And I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to discuss NAFTA today because it's about a trade relationship between three countries that collectively account for 21% of the global economy, which is not insignificant. So as you said, this agreement was developed and ratified in the early to mid-90s when other multilateral trade deals like the EU and Mercosur were being enhanced and formalized. And at that time, policymakers were struggling through the third consecutive economic fall of global growth in as many decades. And they were looking for remedies. And liberalized trade offered at least a partial answer to this. So, of course, NAFTA at the time set a new bar for multilateral trade agreements, and it has by and large delivered on what it was supposed to do. So with the agreement in place, Canadian exports to the U.S. have grown from roughly $200 billion to more than $450 billion annually, while imports from the U.S. have grown at almost the same pace. And today, Canada is the #1 trading partner for 32 U.S. states, which is extremely significant. It's very important. And U.S. trade with Canada and Mexico is linked to 3 million American jobs. And if you add to this the indirect jobs that are supported by trade, you see numbers anywhere between $5 to $8 million $3 to $8 million American jobs that are being created or supported. So that's not insignificant. And on top of this, we have Canadian companies that do invest in the U.S. It's basically affiliates of Canadian companies operating there, and they employ more than 600,000 U.S. workers, which is also very important. So it has delivered on a lot of benefits for Canada and for the U.S. Access to resources, parts, components in Canada and Mexico has also made U.S. companies more productive and better able to compete in overseas markets in Europe and Asia. So that's kind of what NAFTA did. Now, I would like to take a moment to highlight what NAFTA did not do. And I want to go back to detractors of free trade that actually kind of are kind of believing that free trade, including NAFTA, is leading to job losses in the U.S., particularly in the lower and middle classes. However, freer trade across North America was directly linked to the creation of 1 million jobs in the decade that followed the signing of NAFTA. So very positive impact on job creation. And actually, if you look at the losses of jobs in the manufacturing sector, that began in the mid-50s. With no change in pace or rate of job losses at the time that NAFTA came into effect. So really the real driver here of U.S. manufacturing job losses has been automation and technology. Now, don't get me wrong, there's always structural adjustments when an FTA is being implemented, but to assume that trade restrictions will actually bring back jobs is in our view, the wrong assumption. Now, I would like to take a moment to highlight something that is not unique to Canada-U.S. trade, but is very, very important between the two countries, and we call it integrative trade. So, depending on the industry, you have the concept of intermediary goods, and those goods cross the border anywhere between 2 to 7 times before a final product goes to market. So the point is that the two economies are extremely integrated, and you have the same, like in the final product, you will have this constant movement between the two countries. The point behind this I want to make is the unwinding of NAFTA relationship would make things extremely complicated, and it would be extremely painful for workers and consumers, because to actually unwind something like that would take a lot of time and would be very costly. So does it mean that we're not able to renegotiate NAFTA? No, this is not what we're talking about here. But we really see the aspect of the evolution being far better than a revolution, or using the concept of starting from a brand new basis. So we need that evolution in our view, because it was conceived in an era before the internet, and with a limited understanding and, quite frankly, existence of globalized supply chain. So to your point, Dr. Hughes, this was created more than 2 decades ago. So you have other areas like intellectual property, services, labor movement. Everything evolved, and all these things now are at the heart of running a business in today's environment. And of course, to have NAFTA updated to reflect this would be extremely positive. And to be honest, the optimist in me believes that this approach, which is modernizing and updating NAFTA in a transparent and predictable way, is the way the U.S. should and hopefully will adopt. And actually, I'm quite encouraged by the recent declarations. If I actually look at the measured tone of the U.S. Commerce Secretary that we've seen lately, it's kind of informing this view of evolution versus revolution. So Mr. Ross signaled a far more moderate and narrow focus on upgrading NAFTA. He has referenced the TPP, treatment of services, IT, IP protection, and labor movement as a blueprint, and we see this as being positive. After all, if you look at the 3 countries, Canada, U.S., Mexico, there was an alignment at the time of TPP. So to actually look at that basis for engagement, we see that as being positive. Mr. Ross also referenced the aspect of continental security of supply when talking about the U.S. approach to oil self-reliance. And given that the U.S. buys the majority of Canada's oil, a continental mindset would be an important factor in any future NAFTA negotiations on energy. And just a small number here, actually not that small, but if you consider, I mean, we heard the concept, and it created quite an impact here in Canada, of course, but we heard about the concept of a border tax. And if you actually look at a 20% border tax that the U.S. would raise on oil prices, that would actually make a difference of 30 cents at the pump increase in a very short period of time. That's according to the Conference Board of Canada. So a real impact for U.S. consumer if the U.S. was considering some form of border tax here. Now, of course, updating NAFTA is not going to be simple, because there are real and challenging issues, different views on things like dispute resolution, supply management, rules of origin. But always at the core of negotiations will be the fact that none of the parties can ignore the following, is that unwinding the benefits of NAFTA and upsetting the highly integrated continental supply chains will hurt everyone. So we really need to be careful the way things are being done. I just want to take a moment here to use an example of something that's happening right now. And it's not part of NAFTA, actually. It's off NAFTA, but it's very topical from a trade perspective between our 2 countries. And it's really the softwood lumber duties and taxes that are now being applied by the U.S. But it kind of illustrates a dynamic that doesn't serve the interest of the U.S. consumer and the U.S. worker. So despite the fact that provinces modernize their approach to the industry in Canada, starting, I guess, in April of this year, there is now a total of anything between 20 to 30% taxes and duties for Canadian softwood entering into the U.S. And of course, a small group of U.S. producers were able to actually make the government adopt this until longer-term resolution analysis and everything is being done. So there's a process in place, and it's a very long process. And in the meantime, taxes and duties are applied until a conclusion is being reached. But you kind of see implications of that. First, the actual pricing for softwood is up in the U.S. year over year, 10% and up, which is not insignificant. So the U.S. consumer pays more. And on top of that, now if you actually look at the papers this morning here in Canada, I mean, they're talking about potential impact for job losses in Maine. So I'm going back to the integrated economy here, and by trying to limit the input of wood into the U.S., it does have real negative impact for U.S. workers and U.S. consumers. So the last point I will make is that if I now remove kind of more of a policy aspect and I put an entrepreneur hat, when I talk to my clients here, we have clients around the world, and of course we have thousands of clients in Canada. And what entrepreneurs need is essentially more certainty in their business environment. So as we relook at NAFTA, collectively, a long negotiation means that businesses will likely hesitate before making new investments. And it's purely anecdotal at this point, so I don't have any data to support this. And actually, if you look at the investment data, it's a reflection of decisions that were made like several quarters ago. But what I'm hearing now is that entrepreneurs want to see where things will go before making new investments or making more investments. And of course, they're trying to get the best possible return from their current investments. And that's why you see quite a bit of engagement in terms of trade. I mean, trade is strong. But my concern is if there's hesitation from an investment perspective, it will have a real impact on competitiveness or collective economy in the midterm. And it's well known businesses perform well in an environment where they can get good visibility and predictability of outcomes. And I feel that this is not what we have now. And of course, we need to be mindful that if we want to provide the entrepreneurs with the right environment to do business, it will be impacted by all the noise and all the time and everything that could be involved in the renegotiation of NAFTA, and we just need to be mindful of this. So I'll stop there, and I'm really looking forward to the conversations and the questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. You've raised a series of good questions, and we'll return to those a little bit later. I was not surprised to hear about softwood lumber. From people who've lived in the trade world, it's a very familiar issue. It's been around for quite a while. Well, let me turn now to Mr. Hughes. We'd love to get a sense of how the financial world looks at redoing NAFTA, updating NAFTA, and what you think it might mean for Canada in general.
Well, thank you, Kent, and thank you to the Bretton Woods Committee for seeking these Canadian perspectives on NAFTA and trade in North America. We're grateful for the opportunity to speak with the Bretton Woods Committee membership, and we're thankful for your ongoing leadership in convening and conducting conversations like this one, both during the annual and spring meetings at the IMF and World Bank and now. My colleague from EDC did a great job of laying out, I think, the broad train and some of the big issues on NAFTA. So I'm going to complement his remarks by drilling down in a few areas in a little more detail. He laid out what I think are many of the key data points around what has been a very strong success story for NAFTA in the 23 years or so of its existence, a tripling of trade, allowing North America to punch significantly above its weight in economic terms, and the creation of millions of jobs in all three countries, and intensified trading relationships between U.S. states and Canadian provinces and Mexican states. And while a trade deficit or surplus should never be looked at as the metric of whether a trading relationship is successful or not. I think NAFTA has been particularly good to the United States, and that's borne out in the data. While there is a trade deficit for the United States in goods with Canada, that's almost entirely accounted for by resources and energy imports from Canada to the United States that provide a secure and stable supply to U.S. industry and consumers. Additionally, the United States runs a surplus in services with Canada. So on balance, even in a mercantilist view, the trade relationship works very well between Canada and the United States for the United States. And certainly it's a central relationship to Canada. About 3/4 of our international trade happens with the United States. So any changes in our relationship with the U.S. on the trade front are of vital interest to all Canadians. And NAFTA enjoys strong support within Canada. Not only does it poll incredibly positively across the country, you also see all three of our major political parties backing NAFTA, and you've seen in the wake of the presidential election in November 2016 an entire reorganization of the federal cabinet and the employment of past prime ministers, opposition leaders, and provincial premiers, the equivalent of our governors, involved in lobbying at the national, state, and local level across the United States to ensure that the message comes through of the importance of this relationship for Americans and our interest in ensuring that it continues in a constructive fashion. I should emphasize, though, that NAFTA really isn't the only game in town, either for Canada or Mexico. Since the advent of NAFTA in 1994, Canada has signed bilateral trade agreements and multilateral trade agreements with 15 other entities, 12 of which have entered into force. Mexico similarly has signed 20 agreements, and the U.S. itself has signed 15. So while our U.S. relationship remains the centerpiece of Canada's international trading activities, NAFTA is one of many relationships that we're fostering, including a new trade agreement with Europe. That said, the Canadian government and Canada's business community are not just committed, but enthusiastic about maintaining the trilateral relationship that exists under NAFTA between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. As our Prime Minister, our Foreign Minister, and our Trade Minister have all pointed out, there is no interest in breaking NAFTA into a trio of bilateral deals. Such a move, in our view, would dilute some of NAFTA's key strengths. It has helped North America remain competitive with the rest of the world by, as EDC pointed out, creating integrated supply chains across the continent that allow us to leverage effective and productive production in different parts of the continent to reduce prices, increase productivity, and maintain North America's competitiveness with the rest of the world. Mexico plays a key part in that. It has incredibly strong demographics with an expanding middle class. It also has rapidly improving skills. Mexico is generating graduates in engineering that far exceed the numbers here in Canada and are nearly on par with the number of engineers coming out of the United States on a much smaller population base. So really, when we think about the future of trade and the future of markets, an expanding middle class, relatively young demographics, and improved skills in Mexico should be something that is incredibly attractive for both Canada and the U.S., and only underscore why we need to maintain the trilateral nature of this trading relationship. Rather than threatening high-wage jobs in the U.S. and Canada, as has already been pointed out, we believe integration across the continent has allowed us to keep supply chains in North America that might have otherwise gone abroad. And cursory data implies that that belief is well-founded. As has already been noted as well, technology rather than trade has been the main source of the loss of manufacturing jobs in some sectors in Canada and the United States. But it's worth pointing out that technology has also helped preserve jobs. The share of manufacturing jobs in total employment in the United States and manufacturing within total GDP within the U.S. has remained more stable than in any other OECD country in the world. And that's largely because of the flexible adoption of productivity-enhancing technology. In contrast, across the rest of industrialized countries, you've seen a progressive decline in the share of manufacturing in both GDP and employment. That's been mirrored here in Canada, and that certainly has not been driven by our increased trade integration with the rest of the world. Like Mexico, Canada has indicated, though, in light of all the successes under NAFTA, that we're certainly open, and the business community here is open to further modernization of NAFTA. But we think this should be set in context. NAFTA has already been reopened several times since its creation in 1994. Depending on how you count it, you could say that there have been 11 renegotiations of NAFTA already that have spurred thousands of changes in the agreement to keep it modern. So reopening it again should be seen as the norm rather than as a great exception. Services, intellectual property, e-commerce have been noted by all three countries as areas for win-win-win modernizations, and we certainly think those are areas where we should be able to reach rapid agreement in any renegotiation, particularly because all three areas have become more important to each of the economies in recent years. What were path-breaking side agreements on labor and environment in 1994 could be strengthened and brought into the core of the NAFTA agreement, as has been the case in other trade arrangements. But that said, despite the consensus in these areas that we think is broad and relatively deeply based, both the Mexican and Canadian governments have remained relatively circumspect about their negotiating priorities. We think that's entirely appropriate. As the smaller parties in this negotiation, there's little utility in putting out Canadian or Mexican priorities in advance of talks starting in August. They would provide, simply a target for interest groups to align themselves, and would be unlikely to advance toward a constructive conclusion. That said, like the USTR hearings underway this week in Washington, the Canadian government has invited submissions from stakeholders by 18th July for a consultative process on the Canadian negotiating objectives. And as was the case with the American process, that is open to submissions from both Mexican, U.S., and other concerned parties. So I would encourage you to consider that in your operations going forward. Looking at some of the other areas that have been raised as concerns, particularly in the U.S., I should express some Canadian curiosity at both rules of origin and dispute settlement mechanisms as areas of potential renegotiation. In our view, NAFTA's dispute settlement mechanism has worked reasonably well, and particularly well for the United States. As Bretton Woods members will know, the U.S. has yet to lose a single case under the investment protection mechanisms of Chapter 11. And under Chapter 19's trade protections, the decisions by NAFTA's tribunals have been relatively balanced in terms of favoring Mexican, Canadian, and U.S. interests. It's very hard to detect a particular trend or bias in the rulings of the NAFTA tribunals. As well, charges that NAFTA's tribunals have been stacked with Canadian and Mexican interests simply don't square with fact, and are oddly ironic when, from the perspective north and south of the border, any delays in those tribunals conducting their activity have been caused largely by American reluctance to name additional people to the rosters from which the experts are drawn for those panels. And even with changes in these tribunals, it's important to remember all three countries retain the option to take disagreements to the WTO. Additionally, on rules of origin, in the most critical sectors and the largest sectors covered by NAFTA, it's worth noting that minimum content requirements are already well exceeded in areas like the auto sector, and by substantial margins. So there's relatively large room to move up the rules of origin content requirements without affecting trade, but we don't see a pressing or an urgent issue there when in most dominant areas of trade between Canada and the U.S., we're already well in excess of the minimum thresholds outlined. As we move forward, Canada and Mexico, like the United States, I think, are all interested in seeing a relatively swift conclusion to negotiations in order to reduce the uncertainty that hangs over investment within our countries. But I think it's important to remember that American leverage in these discussions, despite the U.S. economy's relative size compared to Canada and Mexico, shouldn't be overstated. In part, because Canada and Mexico both have pursued trading relationships and agreements with other countries, but also because any move to suspend the provisions of NAFTA would, in principle, revert back to most favored nation tariffs, which are actually lower for incoming goods and services from Canada and Mexico to the United States than in the reverse direction from the United States to Canada or Mexico. So, in principle, those tariff rates, which are relatively low, around 3 to 5%, would certainly not destroy trade between our countries, and the prospect of NAFTA being suspended should not be overstated as a stick to move the two partner countries to conclusion of a deal on any terms. Already, about 5 to 10% of trade between Canada and the United States does take place on MFN bases rather than under NAFTA because of some of the onerous provisions that are required in order to prove the locality or the local content of goods. Rather than going through those provisions, some companies choose to trade simply on an MFN basis. Additionally, both Canada and Mexico have indicated that we should not take for granted that the negotiations and concessions achieved under TPP can simply be bolted onto NAFTA. It's worth remembering that the gains and concessions under TPP were negotiated under a completely different set of costs and benefits, and it would be imprudent to take for granted that those TPP agreements can simply be imported into the NAFTA context. It's also important to realize that while uncertainty is probably inhibiting investment to some degree in Canada and Mexico, certainly we're seeing that in some of our most export-intensive sectors, which are at capacity, could certainly trade and supply more with the Canadian dollar at a relatively competitive level right now. We're not seeing the investment that we might otherwise expect. We still expect Canadian growth to accelerate to about 2.6% in 2017, faster than the 2.2% we're projecting for the United States. So to the extent that uncertainty over NAFTA is denting the Canadian economy and therefore providing a nudge for the Canadian negotiators to agree to concessions from the U.S., we're not yet seeing that in the macro picture here. And certainly in Mexico as well, we've seen an upgrading of investment numbers and general growth numbers, reflecting what has been a reduced level of worry about the potential outcome about the NAFTA negotiations. Side disputes on softwood lumber and ultra-filtered dairy milk are things that have been the subject of disagreement between Canada and the United States for decades. And so we don't see the intensification of those discussions as anything particularly new or inimical to concluding the NAFTA negotiations on a positive note. And as already been noted, really in both cases, measures that would be seen as concessions from Canada on those fronts are likely to increase costs for American consumers and ultimately end up being a shot in the foot rather than a victory for the United States. So we very much look forward to a constructive conclusion to the NAFTA negotiations. We think the incentives are aligned for a positive outcome that is a win-win-win for all three countries. But we should emphasize that there is limited incentive to achieve a deal at any cost, and a constructive outcome requires constructive input from all three parties.
Well, thank you again. Another set of very insightful comments that set us up for a serious discussion and a number of questions. I wanted to start by asking you, from a Canadian point of view, what do you think a renegotiated NAFTA should look like and what it might mean for Canada in a positive sense, and what would be the risks of a renegotiated NAFTA from a Canadian point of view? Let me start with you, Mr. Daignault.
I would say in terms of the risks, it's I guess the big concern is if we were to go back on less movement of goods and investments from the baseline we have established today. As I said, the economies are so integrated at this point that we feel that it would bring a lot of uncertainty and a lot of challenges for companies. So I think we have, I see a need to preserve the existing base in order to minimize the risks. Now, this being said, I think the economies have to deal with new challenges that were not necessarily present before. So for instance, the US economy, in our view, is running pretty much at full capacity right now, and you still see some growth. So the prospects of growth are being are very positive. Same thing with the Canadian economy. So I think if you look at the challenges that businesses have to go through today, it's more around labor, and it's more around the actual data flow and exchange of information. And if you are not able to provide the right context or the right framework to be able to assume a freer movement, of those resources, then the question is, how do you maintain competitiveness of the companies and of the economy? So I think the way I see it, providing that we have the right approach, I think it's more about gaining opportunities and competitiveness in the future versus kind of limiting that upside. Again, if I take for granted that we're not going to destroy what we have in place, and we start with the strong base we have in place. So I think that's kind of, it's all about kind of getting the upside, because again, the companies have new challenges now, and labor being one, knowledge being another. So that's kind of what I see in terms of the big risks of not going far enough in setting up a new agreement.
Mr. House, let me ask you the same question with a couple additions. That both of you emphasize how integrated the three economies are. And one of the big changes that Mr. Daignault pointed out was that we not only have the internet, you could also look at containers as another revolution, but third, we really have very integrated global supply chains, and certainly true in North America. So looking at the opportunities, do you share the view that integrating electronically will be a plus, doing something new on intellectual property, and perhaps, as you suggested, adding the environment and labor provisions that were side letters in the NAFTA case, bringing them into the center of the agreement as they would have been in a TPP agreement?
Well, we see substantial gains possible in some very basic areas of NAFTA. Before moving on to some of the points that you mentioned, simple harmonization of customs procedures and smoothing the trade you mentioned, which is incredibly substantial over the Detroit-Windsor border or at Niagara and Fort Erie. These things would be sources of great gains for companies on both sides of the border. Additionally, improved labor mobility between the two countries, so that professionals can work in a more seamless way between Canada and the United States, we think would also produce great gains. Looking more broadly at services, whether they're integrated technologically through electronic or other means, the expansion in services trade between the NAFTA 3 implies that we do need to modernize that part of the agreement to ensure that the flow of services is smoother than it has been previously. Both professional services, services that are provided on a remote basis through things like the cloud or the very webinar that we're participating in today, and intellectual property around those services and goods, I think, can be spelled out in a way that actually does harmonize and allow for easier movement of goods and services between the three countries, and respects the local content requirements that exist in NAFTA and make the existing levels more effective, perhaps, than they have otherwise been. What are dangers in the negotiation? As has been pointed out, if we retreat from the smooth and relatively easy integration that we have right now, we will put North America at a substantial competitive disadvantage against other major trading blocs in the world. The pattern where we see a relatively high-wage, sophisticated, technologically advanced set of countries integrate with a relatively low-wage set of countries is one that's replicated in many areas of the world, whether you look at the European Union and the integration of Eastern Europe, and also through some trade agreements, North Africa into its trading sphere. You really see a mirror image of what we've done in Europe, where high-wage, technologically intensive jobs are being married in supply chains that are integrated with low-wage areas so that different parts of the production chain can be carried out where they're most effective and most cost-advantaged. If we cut ourselves off from that, we're only shooting ourselves in the foot and essentially putting ourselves at a great disadvantage compared with other major trading blocs in the world.
Well, thank you. That gives you a sense of what Canadian priorities would be as well, looking at how to modernize and build on the base that we have. As Mr. Daignault put it, he wants an evolution, not a revolution when it comes to NAFTA. One thing that you haven't mentioned that has been such a hot debate in the United States is the question of currency and how currencies affect the trade of goods, with the sense that a number of countries manipulate or use their currency as a way of getting a trade advantage. In the end, that became a possible side letter to the TPP agreement, something that was not included in the agreement itself. Do you think three countries that don't do that, Canada doesn't do it, Mexico doesn't do it, and the US doesn't do it, do you think it might be an opportunity to introduce a currency chapter to an updated NAFTA as a way of setting a standard for the world? After all, both the GATT and the IMF have language that really weighs against using the currency to gain a trade advantage. What do you think? Maybe start with you, Mr. House, with your life there in the middle of the financial world.
It could be a possible addition. It's certainly not a priority from Canada's perspective. As you noted, neither Canada nor Mexico have been cited as currency manipulators. In fact, Canada is really the original floating currency country. We floated our currency the first of any country in the industrialized world. We went up to the gold standard earlier than the United States. We have long appreciated the important benefits that come with a flexible exchange rate, as has Mexico over the last 20 years. And NAFTA has played a substantially important role in emphasizing the utility of rules-based policymaking in Mexico. To the extent that a currency chapter would provide a model, much as the labor and environmental side agreements provide a model for other trade agreements that have come since NAFTA's agreement, I suppose it could be useful. I think we would generally prefer to see things like that discussed in the multilateral context of the IMF, which is appropriately equipped to assess and analyze currency issues. But to the extent that it may mirror language provided for at the IMF and further strengthen it, I suppose it could be an option, but I think it needs to be a lower priority than other more pressing areas for modernization. I think it's also worth contextualizing that, as we go forward with the NAFTA negotiations, it is during a period in which the US dollar is likely to remain strong. And it needs to be clearly communicated that that does not result from any sort of manipulation amongst major trading, industrialized trading partners that engage with the United States or the two NAFTA partners. To the extent that the U.S. administration is able to deliver on fiscal stimulus and regulatory and tax reform, we should see the upward pressure on the American dollar only increase. to the extent that the Fed moves forward on a tightening path when most of the world's other economies remain in accommodative mode, we're going to see additional pressure upward on the American dollar. That has nothing to do with currency manipulation by the rest of the world. Thirdly, the extent that the strength in the American dollar reflects capital inflows into the United States, it's also reflective of confidence in the American economy. So you've got three different factors setting up to continue to provide support to the American dollar. To the extent that the US dollar is strong over the next few months and years even, it needs to be communicated clearly that that has little relationship to any currency manipulation by the rest of the world.
I know that my Canadian cousins keep telling me it's time to visit, that the Canadian dollar is very attractive and the US dollar is strong, so maybe I'll take advantage of that personally. Mr. Daignault,
Yes.
we talked, get your thoughts on the currency question, but also something else. I know in the negotiations that you recently concluded with the European Union, you made some changes in the dispute settlement regime. Do you think those would be usefully introduced in the new NAFTA?
Yeah. So very quickly, if I might, on the currency piece, I fully agree with what Mr. House has said. It's the level is really driven by the economics fundamental, and let's not forget that not too long ago the Canadian dollar was at par with the U.S. dollar. So it proves the case that really it is not being manipulated, and it's really driven by this kind of fundamental economic factors. So I just wanted to highlight this. Number two, I think it's a great idea if you want to visit Canada. I fully agree with that. We welcome tourism, absolutely. And I just want to also take a moment and go back to your earlier point in terms of the upside, because the comments from Mr. House kind of made me thought about the aspect of services that I think is fundamental to the Canadian economy and also to the U.S. economy, because when we look at the big numbers and the trade flows and the likes, it's of course being influenced by, you know, kind of major companies, goods and the likes. But the reality is that if you look at the structure of the Canadian economy, you do have a big number of companies that are small and medium-sized enterprises. And of course, the U.S. does have also a lot of SMEs as well as part of the economy. It's part of the structure of the economy. And the beauty of having a strong framework for services is that it enables those smaller companies, service companies through technology and right framework to actually access global markets or North American markets. So it is something that we see as being extremely positive because it really benefits all the various sizes and of companies instead of just the major ones. So that's kind of a thing I wanted to position. Now, I'm afraid that in terms of specific knowledge on CETA, dispute mechanism, I'm not the best person to actually answer that question. So I might ask Mr. House to help me here in answering your question on comparing what we have in CETA and see how it would apply to the U.S.
If I could put the question back to you, Kent, are there specific things in the configuration for CETA that you're interested in? Because broadly speaking, the NAFTA dispute settlement mechanisms have provided an example for almost any other dispute settlement mechanism that's been incorporated in bilateral and regional trade agreements since. I still think they are more or less the gold standard. They can be tweaked and improved, no doubt. But most of the CETA template really replicates what we have under NAFTA in many respects. So could I just ask you to concentrate in on a few aspects that you think most interesting?
One of the questions that you hear frequently about investor-state dispute settlements is that there's not an appellate possibility, that today's plaintiff is tomorrow's defense attorney and the next day's judge. So there's a sense of wanting to have, I would say, greater transparency, the ability perhaps to set precedents, that kind of thing. And it emerged here as one of the real contentions, along with the question of currency. Now, that's the reason I thought we might look for some way to strengthen that might in turn garner added support for an updated NAFTA. Well, let me just ask you two very quick questions before we go to our listeners. Both of you have talked about North America as a competitive space itself. And certainly at the Wilson Center, our Canada Institute and our Mexican Institute talk a lot about North America itself as a competitive entity. Could I ask each of you just very briefly to give me 3 things that you'd like to see North America do that would make it collectively a more competitive space? Let's start with you, Mr. House.
Well, I think a few things could be done that would make North America more competitive. First off, as I mentioned, freer movement of professional labor between the 3 economies. 2, much smoother and more integrated customs arrangements and inspection arrangements between the 3 economies so that goods can flow more easily and quickly in lean and just-in-time production processes than they do now. And lastly, I think a resolution of healthcare and the provision of it in the United States would substantially enhance American competitiveness and be a broader good for the entirety of the North American space.
Mr. Daignault?
Yes, I agree with. Yes, I agree with Mr. House. Maybe one aspect I would add is look at whether or not there is more that can be done on the education side. I mean, we basically North America should be a place to attract talent from all around the world. And if we had a integrated way to actually not only attract talent, but to retain that talent, but to actually, I know communities are doing that in cities and the likes, but if there was something in addition that can be done from a North American perspective, that might attract even more talent and brain power into the continent, which is what you need down the road to actually fuel growth and advance, standard of livings and the likes.
Well, thank you both very much. That's an interesting to-do list for North America. Why don't we go to our listeners now? And Emily, if you could ask them to identify themselves and indicate to whom they're directing their question.
Sure. So we do have one question from Dong-Ha Lee from the University of Pittsburgh. It doesn't appear that she has microphone capabilities, so I will ask the question for her. And I believe that you both have touched upon this, but perhaps you can elaborate on this question of why is a multilateral NAFTA so critical to both the Canadian and the Mexican perspectives? So perhaps, Mr. House, you want to start on that.
Well, Canada generally prefers to pursue open trade through the multilateral fora. We have also engaged in regional agreements such as NAFTA, and we believe that trading arrangements are much stronger and more effective within North America through a trilateral agreement rather than a series of bilateral agreements, because if we had bilateral agreements, it is almost a certainty that those bilateral agreements would not be entirely consistent with one another. There would be different standards, different requirements, different expectations, different norms under each of those bilateral agreements between Canada and the US, US and Mexico, Mexico and Canada, and that would be trade inhibiting. That would increase costs for all 3 members, companies and organizations, and ultimately reduce the boost to competitiveness that NAFTA provides to all 3 economies. So it's reasonably straightforward, both in theoretical and practical terms, to show that the gains from free trade within North America would be substantially lower, the administrative burdens and the production burdens would be much higher through a set of bilateral agreements rather than an integrated trilateral agreement. So that's why we are strong advocates for maintaining NAFTA as a three-way deal.
So I fully agree with what Mr. House has said. I would say we start there with a very, very strong base that has proven to be very effective over the last 20+ years. So, so we have the proof that it works very well. Now, this being said, I would add that for future agreements, no doubt that we are in a more difficult environment, and despite the fact that there are some positives and a very strong business case for multilateral transactions, in terms of new transactions, we think that overall, it's not necessarily in a North American context, it's kind of more in a global trade context. It's no doubt being more challenging to implement multilateral trade agreements these days. But this being said, if I go back to NAFTA and if I go back to the three countries, we have very strong base, and we feel that it's the right way to go.
Thank you both for that. We do have another question from Ms. Besma Momani, and I would ask her to please make sure that she can unmute her microphone on her end to pose her question. Ms. Momani, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thank you for this, and hello, Brett. Nice to see you. My question is actually to you, Brett. The question I have is about if NAFTA were to be hypothetically scrapped. I don't think we're there yet, but the theory that we would still be protected here in Canada by the agreement, the 1988 Free Trade Agreement, is that logical? I mean, are we in effect still covered by the 1988 FTA with the United States, and what are the implications or the comparison between the two in terms of if one goes, what does the 88 agreement protect us with?
So it is technically the case that if NAFTA were to be suspended or canceled, relationships between Canada and the United States should revert back to the provisions of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement from '88. That agreement was never canceled. NAFTA was simply bolted on top of it. And under the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, we'd actually already achieved virtually tariff-free trade in most sectors between Canada and the United States. So NAFTA itself really added for Canada the relationship with Mexico. It did not substantially deepen the relationship with the United States. So removing it would not substantially change tariff provisions and access provisions for Canadian producers and consumers. But I say that technically is the case. Politically and legislatively, a reversion back to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement likely would require the passage of some legislation in the US Congress. That may not happen immediately, that may not be smooth, and as a result, that would certainly create some uncertainty and likely some holdups and hiccups for Canadian firms and US firms trading with Canada. Additionally, as I mentioned, we could simply revert to trade in some areas under the MFN, the Most Favored Nation tariffs, which are about 3% and change inward to the United States, nearly 5% inward into Canada. So trade could continue on a relatively low tariff basis, even if we had not worked out what reversion to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement would look like in practice. But in the broader sense of the policy framework, yes, indeed, we should see a reversion back to Canada-US Free Trade from the '88 agreement and the subsequent implementation of that agreement through the '90s were NAFTA to be removed. But that would not be a free and simple process.
Thank you, and I know we have some time constraints to our speakers, so I want to give Mr. Daignault an opportunity to respond to that or to provide any last comments before I turn it over to Dr. Hughes to wrap up.
So nothing really to add, just I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this very interesting discussion, and I hope that it was helpful for the audience.
I want to thank both of our guests for very articulate views. I think you've given us a good view of what Canada sees and what really North America sees in terms of NAFTA and how we might build on it and how we might perhaps create some corrections for whatever flaws really remain. I want to thank the Bretton Woods Committee for arranging this discussion, and I think it would be useful to have another discussion on that question of North American competitiveness and how it might really help all three countries. One question we haven't touched on, and that would merit, I think, another conversation, is that in many cases, the pace of change has left a lot of Canadians, Americans, and disrupted the lives of many Mexicans, too. We need to think about how these gains from globalization and trade really are fairly shared among the rest of our population, and how the disruption that can come with a technological change can be even more devastating, say, than a change in trade. And we need to think about how to prepare all of this for that kind of challenge. Well, thank you again. Thank the Bretton Woods Committee. We hope to be able to talk to you in the future, and I'm going to suggest that the Wilson Center itself call on the two of you for your advice on Canadian and U.S. trade relations. Thank you, Emily. This has been, I think, a very useful discussion.
Thank you to all of our speakers and our moderator for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Some interesting perspectives on this side of the border to hear that we don't typically get to hear. So just want to thank again all of our audience and attendants, and especially to our speakers once again. A recording of this virtual conference will be posted on our website, www.brettonwoods.org. And you should also receive a follow-up email within the next 24 hours that contains a link to the event recording, as well as our email address. I would encourage those that do have questions that didn't get to ask them, if you send them to us, we can pass those along to the speakers if you would like to get a response. So once again, thank you all for joining us, and on behalf of the entire committee, thank you.
Thank you.